Hello from Indiana University, Bloomington. My name is Dr. Brian Moscicki, and your Dr. Miller invited me to talk to your class about bike fits. So, we are going to have a performance side to this, though I will touch on injury, because if nothing else, it's hard to perform well if you are actually injured. So let's start off just kind of thinking about bikes a little bit and how we should look at them when we're trying to fit them to an individual. So first thing, without going into every little caveat about a bike fit, generally bikes fit an individual according to their height to start. Then from there, we're going to have a lot more to deal with. So when we look at a bike, if I have somebody that's 6 feet tall that comes into a bike shop, it's been 20 years since I've done bike fits in a bike shop, but now I do them in the lab. If I had a 6 foot tall person come in, I would say, all right, I'm going to fit you to a 58 centimeter bike. If I had somebody that's 5'4", I might start them out with a 52 centimeter bike. So those are kind of old measurements for bikes. They were a measure that was looking at from the center of this thing called the bottom bracket to the middle of that seat tube where it intersects with the top tube. That measurement was usually pretty close as well for the length of the top tube. Now, there are some problems that can come on here. It's not the best way to measure people for bikes. It's close, but everyone's proportions are different. You might have a shorter torso and longer legs, or vice versa. Or we might have weird structure to the legs themselves. We'll talk about femur versus tibia length in a little while. So the old measurements may not be the best thing to do. So what I've always done thinking about bike fits, coming more from the logical side of things than just tradition, was to actually think about a bike as a grid system. So the 0, point for my grid is the middle of the bottom bracket. If we think about this and a person interacting with a bike, that is one spot that cannot change. So that is the centered point. We are going to talk about changing things around this to get the optimum bike fit. So we can change the seat. This is actually where we're going to spend most of our time today. It's the biggest impact on performance. Now we can change seat height, but one of the other things that we can do, even buy different bikes for this, we could also change the seat tube angle, measurement from horizontal to the back of the seat tube. Or if we have a certain bike and I'm trying to fit it to an individual, we can move the seat back and forth on the seat clamp. You can do lots of different things. I don't want to get into all of it now. So we can look at the seat. We're also going to discuss the handlebars. So we can, with any given bike, with any given stem, move the handlebars up and down. But if we go to a real bike shop or do things ourselves, we can also change the stem itself to make the handlebars go out further, come back closer. And if you know more about handlebars, you can actually buy different types of handlebars that affect how far out your hands go. Then the last one that I know you guys have already talked about in class would be the cranks themselves. They are going to move our position around the bottom bracket a little bit. So I will at least talk about that slightly just because I've done some research in the area of crank lengths myself. Hopefully you'll be able to see it published in a little while. So as we go into the idea of a proper bike fit, I mentioned the old tradition of having the 58 centimeter and 56 centimeter bike. Every bike company, their sizes were different all over the place. So if you are going to go look for your own bike or think about doing this stuff for fun or for money later, bike companies these days have started to report these measurements called stack and reach. So they use the idea of the bottom bracket as this thing that doesn't really move. So now we get a better idea of how the frame is going to fit a person. The stack, as this diagram shows, is a measure from the center of the bottom bracket to a line that goes through the top of the steerer tube. So that measurement can't change. So how tall the bike is essentially. Reach lets us know how long the bike or short the bike is going to be. So we can set that up for our desired type of riding. Now, you'll take a while to figure out what your bike stack and reach is, but I like to build my own bikes. So now I know what I like for certain styles of riding, and when I go to buy a bike frame so I can build it up as I want, I just find frames with the stack and reach. Some frame companies I ride a 58 because I'm about 6'1". Sometimes I ride a 56. So those original traditional numbers aren't as important to me. Now, to make this a little more fun and interesting, we can actually have a volunteer sometimes. So we have Dr. Miller here on his bike on a trainer in his basement. So we're going to start off thinking about Dr. Miller and using him a little bit in our setup. So here I have Dr. Miller on his bike. He came to me with a given bike. He's been riding it for a while, so he's adjusted some things. We'll talk about also how we get a setup on an individual who's not been riding a bike for a while, so a brand new bike. So one of the first things that I actually look at, I don't even bother looking at these numbers yet, is I pay attention to ankle position. The research has shown changing your ankle position doesn't have much of an effect, and actually when you change your position on the bike, you tend to put your ankle in what is a comfortable position for you. So I like to see and ask the individual, or Dr. Miller here, was your ankle and foot position comfortable for you? And if he tells me yes, I make sure that I have a picture or a recording like this video, and I try to keep that the same as I change things for his bike fit. So here we have Dr. Miller, and he has about a 38-degree bend in his knee. So of course it is not that full open angle, it is how much bend he actually has. Now, right now, if you look at it, you say, okay, it might not be a bad bike fit. But let's see what we found in the literature about the proper seat height and what it should look like. So there are common methods for determining an appropriate seat height. We'll actually start with measurements that we might use to determine someone's initial seat height if they've never been set up on a bike before. They have no idea what it should be. We can actually use proportions of their own leg lengths. So use their body to try to get us started. There's two ways that it's commonly done. One of the more common ways is to get a person set up in whatever shoes they're going to ride in. We're going to assume for this presentation most people ride in real bike shoes that clip into their pedals. So we get them in those shoes, and then we measure their inseam. I would typically do it by having them stand with their back to the wall and put a book between their legs, and then I simply measure the length of their inseam. I then multiply that by your 109%, so 1.09, and that gives me a good estimation of what their seat height should be set up as. Same thing can be true for 97% or greater trochanter height. Just do that measurement on the outside. So now I would set the seat up from the top of the seat to the middle of the pedal spindle with everything in line. That's going to be my first estimation of seat height. Now, to get a little more in depth, we're going to actually want to use knee angle as one of our best determinants of appropriate seat height, though there are some caveats we'll come to in a minute. So if we look down at the table below from this article that I pulled out, they did a comparison of common methods of determining seat height. So they had these individuals ride at a given wattage, and then they're looking at what is their oxygen consumption, so giving us an idea of economy here. Costs the most to ride at 109%. So why is that a problem? So why can't we just use it? Remember we talked about people having different proportions? So if you have two people with a 32-inch inseam, one person might have a short femur and a long tibia, using that to exaggerate. Another person might have a longer femur and a shorter tibia. That is going to affect knee angle. So we want the knee angle to be relatively straight so that we can have a good mechanical advantage when we're pedaling our bike. So we don't want our knee too bent, and we also don't want it too straight, which we'll come to in a little while. So this 25 to 35 degree measure, there isn't much of a difference in the initial cost of cycling for these two. So why is there a range? If we're looking at pros, people trying to be the best, we're going to get them as straight as we can, close to this 25. But for most people that I would actually do a bike fit on, I'm probably going to be closer to this 35 number. If you remember, Dr. Miller was about 38, so I tried to get him to raise his seat a little bit more. What's going to get me to think about the difference between a setup of a 25 degree and a 35 degree knee angle? It is actually the person's flexibility. Your hamstrings are going to be a factor here. Remember, if we're actually riding this bike, we're leaned over a bit with our hands on the handlebars. So if I'm trying to get my leg in this position, well, my hamstrings can be a limiting factor. So if the person has limited flexibility in their hamstrings, you would at least start them out closer to the more bent knee where we're not stressing the hamstrings too much. Now, how do we figure this out? How do we get a better measure to determine, okay, should I do 35, 30, 25? Well, there's a pretty simple way to do it to determine if you're putting the seat up too high because their hamstrings might be too tight. It is to actually just take a different view of the subject cycling. So I had Dr. Miller also send me a video of this posterior view, and I'm actually put this line in so that I can measure movement in his pelvis. So rocking of the pelvis. If the seat's too high, the hamstrings may be limiting your legs from flexing, so to get the extra motion in the body that the knee can't give you, you're going to compensate by dropping your pelvis down. And over time, that's not going to be comfortable for you. But in this instance, I would actually simply take my hand, place it over top of the individual's sacrum, and I would feel if they're rocking or not, because it's actually kind of hard to see. So you can feel the motion a little bit easier. So that tells us if our seat's a little too high or not, and can tell us if we're trying to creep too close to 25 degrees of knee flexion, and we should be closer to 35 degrees. Now, there are other things we can do. If a person has come in with their own bike fit, and they've been riding it for a while, one of my checks would be, are you having any pain in any specific areas? And two common places are going to be knee pain and back pain. So I'll actually talk about back pain first, because it comes from what we just talked about. If your seat was set too high from optimal, you rock your pelvis, back and forth, and that causes your lumbar spine to have to flex sideways, lateral flexion. So that can lead to back pain over time. So that can be a signal, well, I need to look to make sure that person's seat is not too high. Now we have the other side of it. If they have, in particular, patellar knee pain, anterior knee pain, that may mean that their seat is set too low, leading to too much knee flexion, putting extra stress on the quadriceps. So we use more quads when our legs are bent more in this position, and that can lead to excess stress on the patella, the cartilage underneath of it, or even just the patellar tendon. That's why I kind of listed it as anterior patellar pain. So we have all these measures that we can use to try to determine the proper seat height. So best to use knee angle as our estimate, but we also have to take the body's own proportions in. So we have to look, are you flexible enough? Is your pelvis moving? And go to the highest position we can before the pelvis starts tilting. Now, another thing that comes in with the seat, as we mentioned in our introduction, is seat tube angle. Now, seat tube angle is usually actually going to be determined by if you're racing or not, and what race you're doing, if the rules allow you to use different seat tube angles. So on a road bike, a traditional road bike will have a seat tube angle of about 73 degrees, plus or minus 1 degree either way. All depends on the manufacturer you're buying from. Now, a triathlon bike, on the other hand, I'll say non-draft legal triathlon bike, most triathlons in the United States are going to be this way, would usually be set up with a steeper seat tube angle. So we'll see why that's important in a little bit. But one thing you might say, well, if I change the seat tube angle compared to what a traditional road bike's been for decades, is that going to affect performance? And this study by BC pretty much shows us, no, it's not. So they examined using a shallower traditional road type seat tube angle versus a steeper triathlon-ish seat tube angle. And what they saw for these estimates at 200 and 300 watts was that there was no real difference between them. Slight differences, but not statistically significant, so it could be slight performance differences. But you could ride a triathlon bike with a steeper seat tube angle and still maintain a pretty high power output without any sacrifice. Now, another thing to think about, though, is if you're going to go to a steeper seat tube angle, it affects your seat height. So, as you can see in this picture, I had to doctor it a little bit to make it work, but the seat here is the same as the traditional seat. So if we go to a steeper seat tube angle, you usually have to raise your seat more as you slide it forward. So simply because we're moving along the arc, that we have to raise the seat. We're not going to talk about mountain bikes. They typically tend to be around a road bike seat tube angle. So we'll just kind of leave it there. Now, some more ideas about this seat tube angle. Seems to be the only time we really worry about it is in triathlon. So we're actually going to take a second and we're going to talk about triathlon and the need for different seat tube angle. So why did people do it? It actually started not in a lab, but the founder of Quintana Roo Bikes made the first real bikes with steep seat tube angles. So the idea was we just felt better. When we had a steeper seat tube angle, people felt like they could run better off of it. So Garside in 2000 published a study actually examining that, comparing a simulated Olympic distance triathlon. So that means ignoring the 1,500 meter swim, a 40 kilometer bike followed by a 10K run. Because on a traditional road bike, we road bike and then we stop. We don't have to run right after. So our previous exercise is going to affect the following. So if we just focus on the steep seat tube angle for a moment, well, when Garside had these individuals cycle, there was a slight difference in their cycling times, but not significant. But the interesting piece is on the 10 kilometer run, they had over a 3-minute difference in time. That is huge difference in time for a 10 kilometer run, and actually the majority of the difference occurred in the first 5K, which really means that you got off the bike and ran better immediately afterwards. So they actually showed, I didn't want to get into all of it, but they looked at running speed and stride frequency and all that. It was better with a steeper seat tube angle. Now, to kind of coordinate with that, Sylder basically took this concept and wanted to determine why. Why did we maybe run better afterwards? And in this study, one of the main takeaways that relates to this is as we go to a steeper seat tube angle, it actually makes your body ride with a little more quad dominance and a little bit less hamstring activation. So basically thinking we're saving our hamstrings to help propel ourselves better during the run is what Sylder basically said to tell us why Garside had the findings he had. Now, another thing I have here is aero bar usage. So one other piece we can throw in with triathlon cycling is it's pretty much ubiquitous, at least again in the US, that we're using aero bars for triathlon. So we're going to take this idea and kind of go with it for a minute and think about torso position relative to our handlebar position. So the next level of fit, if we get out of the seat finally, is into where do we put our hands and how is that going to affect our torso in this linkage system we have of our body interacting with the bike. So there are three common places that we are going to, we'll say, put our hands when we're riding a bike. One is on the hoods. That's the most common place. So on top of the brake hoods, most common place because it's most comfortable, but it's also the safest because you have best access to your brakes. The drops are, of course, getting down into the lowered curve aspect of your handlebars. And then if your race or governing body, whatever you're doing, or you're just riding on your own, allows it, you can use aero bars. So for time trials or for triathlons. Now, this Durrell study wanted to determine how these positions affect our body's ability to perform in cycling. So that allowed us to look at a few things. General use of hand position, but as we go into these different positions, it will actually affect our torso angles. So up on the hoods, we're sitting upright. Or sorry, up on the hoods, we're upright. On the drops, we are a little bit lower. And in the aero bars, typically you set yourself up even lower than you would be in drops. So the general progression is we would have lower drag as we move from left to right in these particular structures. So what Durrell found was you actually cycled better, you had better cycling economy in the upright position and in the aero position because you aren't supporting yourself in the super low position. Now, this kind of just shows us, yeah, these would be better to use if we can, but there's one other thing I want to talk about when we're thinking about the use of these aero bars. So hoods versus aero bars is going to be how most people would kind of set up their bike when they're riding. Well, the lower we go, the better we're going to be able to ride, right? Less drag means we have less resistance to ourselves moving. So if we actually take that then into triathlon, by sliding the body forward with a steeper seat tube angle, it actually opens up the hips more. So it is more comfortable. And comfort can relate to performance because if we're riding in an Ironman that's a 112-mile bike, well, by being able to be more comfortable when in the aero bars, you'll stay in them longer. So you won't have to sit up and you'll have lower drag. What some research has shown is being able to stay in your aero bars, riding in your aero bars, is equal to drafting off of somebody in a pace line. So that can be 50 to even possibly 100 watts I've seen in one study of estimated reduction in your need to produce power by decreasing drag. So I love to look at this triathlon stuff. That is specifically the type of cycling that I tend to research. So steeper seat tube angles, aero bar usage lead to faster times in triathlon cycling. All right, we're going to get into our last little bit of bike fit, and that is not even done in a lot of bike fits. This is in a higher end, more expensive kind of bike fit, and we would actually start to look at the cranks themselves. Most of the times people ride the cranks that come on their bike. I know you've talked about cranks a bit, so we'll assume you know a little bit. But one of the things we have to think about is not just how long your cranks are, but we have to think about the width at which you're setting your feet on your bike. So one of the things that dictates that is called the Q factor. So if you remember Q angle on your knee, well, this is basically drawn from that. But the Q factor is the width of the crank relative to where you attach your pedals, so where you screw your pedals into it. The idea, more performance directed bikes are narrow on their own. They have narrow tires. That allows for them to have narrower cranks, and the thought is you would have your legs closer together and less profile drag, so you would be able to perform a little bit better. Now there are some other things that are going to affect this though. We have race bikes, yes, but not all bikes are race bikes. Not as many bikes these days comes with it, but some bikes have 3 chain rings on the front, not 1 or 2. So that would require your cranks to be wider. Widening your cranks would then widen where your feet have to go on your pedals. So that's going to affect our rider itself. Another instance where we see wider cranks are with mountain bikes or fat bikes. Another fun category of bikes we can get into. But if you have a wider tire, your cranks have to be able to move past your chainstays and the width of the rear tire itself, so that necessitates a wider Q factor. So how is that going to affect our cyclist? Well, when we're looking at a cyclist pedaling, we generally want the tibia to basically stay vertical. That tends to mean good knee tracking for our individual. However, some people are going to come in, whether it's on the initial bike fit of a bike they've had or are after getting a bike fit riding for a few weeks, they may come in and say, oh, I might have some medial or lateral knee pain. Lateral knee pain is a little bit more common, and it usually comes from the foot moving in a little bit. So if we think about that, just think about any individual. If we had a foot with a normal arch to it and the arch is flattened, what's that going to do to the leg? Well, it causes the tibia to move in, femur then angles out, so we now have a valgus force on the knee. Over time, that causes lateral knee pain. So if we're looking at this, we don't even have to see the foot really. You can usually see it in the knee. If this is happening to an individual, so you don't even have to have the knee pain listed first, we usually see the knee wagging. So the knee moves back and forth, medial, lateral, as they're pedaling. So from there, we need to determine, is it a medial or lateral issue? But much of the time, it is related to an arch issue. So we can actually just have the subject or individual put a arch support in their bike shoe, and that might fix the problem. If their arch is supported fine as it is, there's another thing on these nice clipless pedals on bikes, is you can actually put wedges between the shoe and the cleat to wedge the foot out, getting the tibia and the femur to now be in line as they should. Now, medial pain is essentially the opposite. Leg tends to fall out, so I'm not going to go through that whole thing because it's just the opposite idea. Now, my last consideration, as I said, I will talk about crank length. This is a study that I'm yet to publish, but hopefully it'll be out in the next 6 months or so. But it did present it at ACSM. So what I did was have trained triathletes, so they're all relatively competitive, but just local triathletes come in, and I had them ride at a prescribed bike fit. So a standardized bike fit, riding with a 79-degree seat tube angle. I set them up with a 30-degree knee bend and a pretty relaxed 30-degree torso angle when they're riding on the aero bars. So we can see that in the images in the middle of the page here. Now, I tested the subjects. I did a VO2 max test, and then I had them ride at 95% of their first ventilatory threshold. So pretty close to what most people call your lactate threshold. I had them ride below that because that's what you would usually do for a long distance race. Now, what we can see here is 175 is what we call our traditional length cranks. So it's pretty close to what comes on most people's bikes. And then from there, I had 10 millimeter increments lower, all the way down to 145. As you can see here, as we go to a lower crank length, for the same oxygen consumption, my subjects actually, in the mean for the group, were able to ride at 11 watts higher, so more economically with this shortest crank length. Now it's a mean, so not every single subject rode better with the 145s. But the interesting part is that all of my subjects reported that the two shortest crank lengths were the most comfortable. So remember what I said about drag and use of aero bars. So if we have a nice steep seat tube, we're going to ride at a below threshold intensity. Shorter cranks actually made these people more comfortable so they could sit in their aero bars, have less drag as they're cycling, and possibly perform better. Now the thing we haven't gotten to yet is, do short cranks affect your ability to run after? So hopefully I'll be doing that study in the next year or so when it's a little easier to get subjects. All right, I want to thank you for inviting me to come talk to your class. I hope you enjoyed this at least a little bit.